What would it take for you to join a war that had a nearly 100% casualty rate? What would it take for you to join a war that killed a million of your fellow countrymen? For the average Russian male, that is a question that's not hypothetical because Russian casualties have just surpassed the 1 million mark. And just what is Vladimir Putin and his war machine doing to make sure that the battlefields of Ukraine continue to be flooded with dead Russians? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's break down this crazy story. But first, I wanted to take 1 second and get a word from our sponsor, Incogni. I make no apologies for my opinions, but being critical of powerful people means that I care about who has my data. But honestly, everyone who uses the internet should care about who has information about them and their families. Often, data about us, like our name, age, address, and phone number, is sold to the highest bidder by companies called data brokers. Last year, scammers stole nearly $5 billion from victims, and the data obtained from data brokers is essential to their operations. That's where today's sponsor comes in, Incogni. Incogni is a data removal service that scrubs your data from nearly 230 data broker sites. With Incogni, I didn't have to fill out a bunch of forms or send angry emails. I signed up, they took over, and within days, the removals started rolling in. My data just isn't out there for sale anymore. If you're a journalist, a veteran, a parent, or someone who just doesn't want your data in the hands of brokers, Incogni is for you. Use my link below to get 60% off the annual Incogni plan. That's the highest discount they offer. Protect yourself before your data is used against you. Okay, so take a look at this with me, right? So recently, actually today, the Russian losses in Ukraine are going or have passed 1 million. Now, bear in mind, guys, losses, it reflects casualties, and casualties in military parlance is 3 categories. The first is KIA, killed in action. The second is going to be grievously wounded, individuals who are so wounded they can't return to combat. And the third is individuals who are wounded but are able to be returned to combat. So this number, right, you can assume that probably about 50 to 60% of this 1 million number are what are called unrecoverable losses. Some of them are individuals who've been wounded, right? And some of them are wounded multiple times. So this 1 million number is not actually like a million Russians who are, put in the ground, but you can assume, again, that about 50% of that is either KIA or so severely wounded that they can no longer continue to fight. And this is a massive number. I want to put this in context for for Russia generally. You can see here that this is what's called the Russian population pyramid. This reflects kind of the demographic and age split of Russia's population. And you can see Russia has a huge problem because you can look, Russians under the age of 25 more or less don't exist, right? They make up just a tiny fraction of the population. In contrast, basically their largest single cohort is Russians between basically the ages of about 30 and around 50. And this is not even that large a cohort. You can see here, the rest of this population pyramid actually fairly starts to even out. But remember, the life expectancy of a Russian male is just 64 years old. And you can see why, right? After about 65, the Russian population pyramid just kind of starts to vanish. But here's the other crazy thing to take away is that when you have a total population of 146 million, right? We're going to pull out the old calculator and we're going to learn a little something here, right? So if you have 146 million and you assume that the population is 50% male, 50% female, which is not true. Like, look at this chart. You can very clearly see the population actually skews female. There's literally more pink on this chart. But you're talking about 73 million men in Russia. And the fact that there is a million casualties implies that up to 1 in 73, or probably more like 1 in every 100 men in Russia has been wounded in this war, which is insane. This is an insane level of conflict, especially given that, as this article points out, that the Russians are not conscripting people. This is not a conscription army, right? This is in fact the only way that the Russians can politically, or that Vladimir Putin can politically navigate this unpopular war, or rather keep the war popular enough for him to continue it, is to have an all-volunteer force. But the problem is, what does it take to volunteer, right? And because remember, Russia takes huge numbers of casualties. One analyst estimates that Russia loses and then recruits between 35,000 and 45,000 people per month, that they might recruit a little bit north of that number. So they might be growing ever so slightly. To do this, Russia has had to roll out a bonus sum that is absolutely preposterous, right? A one-time sign-up bonus that is $40,000 in a country where the average monthly wage is $1,000. That's the equivalent roughly of 3.5 years of full-time work just for signing on the dotted line. But remember, they also have absolutely preposterously high monthly salaries for as long as these soldiers are alive, plus a large death benefit, right? Meaning that for the average Russian, the actual payday is massive. Well, not for them, they're dead, but their families get massive, massive paydays. And the fact is that this is actually a huge economic problem for Russia, because the daily cost of paying these sign-up bonuses is $24 million for Russia, right? It is just not sustainable. And military spending in Russia is 6.3% of GDP, the highest level since the Cold War, and its budget deficit continues to rise. Plus, the fact is the Russian economy is basically being sustained by lending from Russian banks. But the problem is you can only really pump money out via banks for so long before the banks themselves become insolvent. But I think the underrated liability in Russia is this chart, right? Because you have to think that for Russia, one, you can take some of these men, as we talked about. Some of these men simply don't apply, right? 0 to 4-year-olds, 9-year-olds and below, 10 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 19-year-olds. Just dismiss this part of the pyramid. And this represents, about 15%, maybe, no, this represents about 10, 12% of the pyramid, right? 2.5 and 2.5, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, it represents about 12% of the pyramid are boys under the age of 18. Okay. But then, so of the remaining Russians, you have some that are simply too old to serve, right? If you're over 70, Russia's probably not going to recruit you. Probably, if you're over 65, Russia's not going to recruit you, which means that you're talking about only a small subset of Russian men that are working age men. These are the most economically productive citizens in the Russian Federation. These are also extremely valuable. This is their working years. These guys, remember, a child, if you are a country, a child draws from resources, right? I pay my taxes knowing full well that a bunch of middle school kids are getting lunches. They're having teachers teach them algebra. That's fine. I live in a society. I'm okay with that. And the whole reason it works is because when we teach all those middle schoolers algebra, in a decade, they are going to be workers in the economy. They're going to be paying taxes. And because remember, part of my taxes too also go towards old people. My Social Security payments go towards making sure that everyone's grandma doesn't starve to death, right? Again, this is a fine deal for a society. I receive some taxpayer money to be educated as a kid. Then I work hard and contribute taxpayer money to educate the next generation. And then when I get old, I draw on my pensions. The problem is that Russia doesn't have enough of these people, these working age males. And Vladimir Putin has begun to shave more and more off the top of his all-important tax base. Because remember, what else happened? During the early stages of the conflict, there was a large mobilization in which a lot of Russians, working age, military age Russians, fled the country. And so I think for Russia, yeah, their economy is definitely going to be under strain from this massive, massive loss of troops. But the largest problem that Russia is going to have is these guys here, right? The fact is that they are not going to be able to sustain this, not just economically, right? I keep framing Russian men as existing as economic units, and that's true, but they're also social units, right? How long is the Russian public going to be willing to sit there and watch their fathers, uncles, brothers killed off for no reason? Look at the US in the Vietnam War, right? Yeah, the first, I don't know, 3-4 years of the war, there really wasn't a huge anti-war movement. It wasn't until 67, 68 that enough of the public had said, wow, you drafted my brother, you drafted my cousin, you drafted my father, and he was killed, or he came back and said, this is a terrible war. There's nothing good that's happening as a result of this. And a lot of the public turned against the war only when it came home, so to speak. And that, I think, is one of the fears of the Russian government, is that they are paying economic costs. And certainly they can't do that for an indefinite amount of time, but they are paying a social cost, right? As we've always talked about, part of the reason a public is willing to stomach a dictator is because they offer something that is more valuable to people than freedoms, which is security. If they have a belief that the dictator is able to preserve their physical well-being from threats, then they are willing to say, hey, I'm okay with the fact that I don't vote for my leader. I'm okay with the fact that I don't get freedom of speech to say what I want. I'm okay with the fact that I don't have these delineated rights in this country. And that is the deal that essentially Putin struck with Russians. They lived in a quasi-failed state through basically the 90s, in which gangs and criminal enterprises and drugs just simply took over the country in a total collapse of all social institutions. And so for the average Russian, they said, yeah, Vladimir Putin isn't a good guy, right? He's not a nice guy. He's not committed to our freedom. But they say, when we had a constitution and freedom and democracy, we also had institutions, so much social rot that it basically just gave criminals the freedom to do whatever they wanted. The issue is that when the state becomes the criminal enterprise, when the state begins to kill more people than it ever protected from external threats, particularly when it kills them, protecting the state from a threat that common sense and the median Russian said did not exist, right? Nobody really thinks that NATO was about to strike Russia. There were no NATO troops in Ukraine. And Ukraine certainly wasn't going to strike Russia because Ukraine's military was tiny compared to the Russian Federation. And even with a fully mobilized Ukraine at the apex of their Kursk offensive, they were like 40 kilometers into Russia. This is obviously patently obvious that Ukraine is not a pressing threat to Russia. NATO was not a pressing threat to Russia. Again, look no further than the fact that when the war started, right, when the Russian, so many Russian men fled mobilization, where did they go? They didn't go to China. They didn't go to Iran. They went to Western Europe, right? So it seems kind of weird, right, to say, oh, I'm going to flee to my enemies' countries. It doesn't make any sense, and the median Russian knows this. They know that this is propaganda. And so in the aggregate, what I think you have is a sense, a growing sense, I think, among the Russian public, even if they won't say it, right? Because it's not going to show up in surveys, right? Russians are not stupid. They see a person with a poll and a clipboard, and they're writing things down. They know exactly what they need to say. So yes, Putin always polls great. The war always polls great among the Russian public. And a lot of people take this to say, oh, this is a sign that the Russian public really supports the war. No, the Russian public, it would be a crime. It would be a crime for a Russian to admit they don't support the war, right? Verbally denigrating the military operation is a crime in Russia, one that is enforced. So to sit there and point to Russian polling data, I think is nonsense. What you would see instead is what we are seeing. You would see fewer and fewer people sign up for the war. which is they say, oh, well, that's not true. You just said there are a ton of people signing up. But to keep those numbers up, there need to be larger and larger bonuses, right? You have to pay people more and more to keep signing up to fight. And that isn't just a function of inflation. It's also a function of the fact that there are simply not enough of this chunk of men left who are willing to raise their hands and say, yes, kill me, please, right? And if you have a family, you understand intuitively what I'm talking about, that there is a level at which there is a level of risk in which they say, listen, there is no amount of money that is going to get me to leave my children, to have my children grow up without a father, right? To abandon my sick or aging mother, right? This is the fundamental social calculus. And so, yes, everyone looks at the economic calculus because that's the data we have. But you have to believe that beyond this, there is a social calculus of losing 1 million people, or we'll be generous, say 500,000 people, but that's still nearly 1 in every 100 Russian men. And that the question is, how long is that going to be sustained? And the fact is that a lot of people say, oh, well, Ukraine will break first. But there's a key difference. Look at Vietnam. The public knew that they were fighting a war of choice. Vietnam was never going to launch nuclear weapons into New York City, right? It was just not possible. The Vietnamese were like, the U.S. is bombing your wife, your family. They're bombing Hanoi. And so the North Vietnamese, despite having a smaller population, despite having a much smaller economy, despite having only limited help from external countries, was still able to defeat the United States simply because their people were committed to winning the war, while the United States simply lost the political will to continue the fight. Now, admittedly, in a democracy, what the average person thinks is a lot more impactful. But Vladimir Putin still needs a baseline level of popular support, right? A dictator cannot be he doesn't have the apparatus to inflict, to lose total public support, right? Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. That is the most important story that I wanted to cover. I think it's really important. It's a huge milestone. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members, and of course to Incogni, today's sponsor. I appreciate you guys so much. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you tomorrow. Cheers.